MOCA is a rapid screening tool designed to detect mild cognitive dysfunction. It assesses multiple cognitive domains including memory, language, attention, visuospatial and executive function, abstraction, naming and orientation. It contains 16 items and 11 categories with a total score of 30. This assessment takes 10 to 15 minutes to administer. The assessment tests under ICF domains body structure and body function. 3 alternative forms of the test are available in English to reduce likelihood of practice effects. The MOCA is also available in 48 different languages and dialects and in a form for visually impaired clients. To administer this test, you will need the score sheet, a stopwatch, pencil and paper. Scoring. There is a total score of 30, with a score of 26 or greater being considered normal. 1 point is added if clients have completed less than 12 years of formal education. The scoring criteria provided for each category and item. Item 1. Alternating trail making. The examiner instructs the subject to draw a line going from a number to a letter in ascending order, beginning at point 1 and ending at point E. 1 point is allocated if the client successfully draws that pattern. Item 2. Visio-constructional skills. The cube. The examiner instructs the client to copy the drawing as accurately as possible. 1 point is allocated for correctly executed drawing. Drawing must be three-dimensional, all lines are drawn, no line is added, and lines are relatively parallel and the length is similar. A point is not assigned if any of the above criteria are not met. Item 3. Visio-constructional skills, the clock. The examiner indicates the space on the right and asks the client to draw a clock, putting in all the numbers and set the time to 10 past 11. 1 point is allocated for each of the following 3 criteria. Contour. The clock face must be a circle with only minor distortions. Numbers. All clock numbers must be present with no additional numbers. Numbers must be in the correct order and placed in the approximate quadrants on the clock face. Hands. There must be 2 hands jointly indicating the correct time. The hour hand must be clearly shorter than the minute hand. Hands must be centered within the clock face and their junction close to the clock center. A point is not assigned for a given element if any of the above criteria are not met. Item 4. Naming. Beginning on the left, the examiner points to each figure and asks the client to name each animal. 1 point is given for each correct response. Item 5. Memory. The examiner reads a list of 5 words at a rate of 1 per second, informing the client that this is a memory test and they will need to remember these words now and later on. It doesn't matter what order the client says the words, and they will be given 2 trials to remember them. No points are given for trials 1 and 2. Item 6. Attention. Forward digit span. The examiner reads the 5-number sequence at a rate of 1 digit per second and asks the client to repeat the numbers back to them in the same order. Backward digit span. The examiner reads the 3-number sequence at a rate of 1 digit per second and asks the client to repeat the numbers in the backwards order. 1 point is given for each sequence correctly repeated. Vigilance. The examiner reads a list of letters at a rate of 1 per second and asks the client to tap their hand each time they hear A. 1 point is given if there are 0 to 1 errors. Serial 7. The examiner asks the client to count backwards from 100, subtracting by 7. This item is scored out of 3. No points are given for no correct subtractions. 1 point is given for 1 correct subtraction, 2 points for 2 to 3 correct subtractions, and 3 points if the client successfully makes 4 to 5 correct subtractions. Item 8. Verbal fluency. The examiner asks the client to tell them as many words as they can think of that begin with a certain letter of the alphabet. 1 point is allocated if the client can generate 11 words or more in 60 seconds. Item 9. Abstraction. The examiner asks the client to explain what each pair of words has in common, starting with the example, "Tell me how an orange and a banana are alike." If the subject answers in a concrete manner, then give them a second chance to come up with a different response. Only the last 2 item pairs are scored. Give 1 point for each item correctly answered. Item 10. Delayed recall. The examiner gives the following instructions. I read some words to you earlier which I asked you to remember. Tell me as many of those words as you can remember. Make a check mark for each of the words correctly recalled spontaneously without any clues in the allocated space. Allocate 1 point for each word recalled freely without any cues. Item 11, orientation. The examiner asks the client for the date, month, year, day, place, and city. Give 1 point for each item correctly answered. The sum of all subscores listed on the right-hand side makes up the total score. Add 1 point for an individual who has 12 years or fewer of formal education for a possible maximum of 30 points. A final total score of 26 and above is considered normal. Mr. Merriman is a 68-year-old man who has been living with Parkinson's disease for the past 6 years. He was referred to Bandura Community Rehabilitation Centre after dropping books at a library where he works. Mr. Merriman's GP has some concern about his ability to safely perform his usual occupations. Mr. Merriman lives alone and enjoys attending the local library 3 days a week as a part-time librarian to assist with shelving books and the inquiry desk. He has always been independent with all domestic tasks, but lately during cooking activities he finds that sometimes his thoughts freeze. For example, he says, the other day when I was halfway through making a pie, I lost track of what I was meant to be doing next, even though I make that pie from memory every week. The OT decided to administer the mocha to determine the level of cognitive dysfunction Mr. Merriman is experiencing. Consent. Prior to the administration of the assessment, the OT will explain why the assessment is being conducted, how the assessment will work, and must obtain consent in the form of verbal confirmation that the client is okay to participate in the assessment and ready to commence. Shared decision-making. Throughout the decision-making process, the OT must ensure that the client has been included in the process. Their preferences must have been considered whilst planning the assessment and when planning intervention once the results of the assessment have been obtained. It is important to be sensitive when discussing results of the assessment with the client and ensure they understand what the results mean and have been given an opportunity to ask questions. In summary, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment is a rapid screening tool to measure mild cognitive impairment. This assessment can be used for multiple populations, including stroke, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and those who are experiencing cognitive impairment but score normally on the mini mental state exam. The assessment takes 10 to 15 minutes to administer, and multiple versions exist for those with visual impairments and for different languages.